The land behind me is Chalon in northern France. Today, Chalon is in the heart of the Champagne region. But 1600 years ago, in 451 AD, it was the scene of one of the biggest and bloodiest battles in ancient history. I'm Matthew Settle. Nearly 500,000 men fought here as the Roman general Aetius tried to halt the advance of Attila the Hun and his terrifying barbarian hordes.
Hoje, com a tecnologia dos videogames, podemos visualizar como foi a batalha, o grande número de soldados, a formação das tropas em luta e como ela foi vencida. Veja o que os generais gostariam de ver agora em Batalhas Decisivas. Batalhas Decisivas.
In 451 AD, the Roman Empire was in tatters. The glory days of Augustus, a distant memory.
O Império Romano se estendia do Mar Mediterrâneo até a Europa, Ásia e África. Em 451 d.C., Roma não era mais o centro do governo, e o Império estava dividido em dois. Enquanto o Império Oriental sediado em Constantinopla era rico e bem conduzido, o lado ocidental fora devastado pelas tribos bárbaras.
The Roman Empire was neither Roman nor it was an empire. It had been dissected between East and West. It was not in control of its borders.
They would have been progressively hard-pressed to see a oneness in the empire that was about them. It was made up of armies, it was made up of governors, it was made up of garrisons and towns. It had become a fragmented world.
De Ravenna, norte da Itália, Valentiniano III governava os restos do Império Ocidental e almejava o comando da Espanha, Gália e Itália, países controlados por líderes locais e colonizadores bárbaros. A Gália, a atual França, era dominada pelos visigodos e a Itália pelos vândalos.
What's more, Valentinian's general and chief advisor, Flavius Aetius, was half barbarian.
He was obviously a very capable commander with considerable experience. He was clearly a very considerable politician. He had occupied the top spot for quite some years.
He had an Italian mother, but was raised among the Visigoths, and had even spent a year with the Huns.
He knew Hunnic ways. He grew up in a silk tent. He learned to ride a horse, probably with the Huns.
He's often called the last of the real Romans, the last of the noble Romans, or the noble Roman, inasmuch as for 30 years he seems to have been very active on the northwest frontier of Rome in a series of holding actions, trying to keep out Franks, trying to keep out Goths from getting into the unprotected and bountiful areas of central Italy and Spain.
O Império Ocidental era um alvo tentador para as tribos bárbaras. E em 451 d.C., um líder bárbaro se destacava de todos os outros, Átila, o Huno.
Attila is represented as the super barbarian.
He was slightly graying, he was bent over, he was very muscular, probably entering middle age, squat, dark, swarthy person.
Os hunos eram cavaleiros das estepes asiáticas.
Many of the Germanic tribes were Christians of some shape or form. The Huns were not. And, of course, Attila was described as being, quote, the scourge of God.
Todos temiam os hunos, e com razão. Em um ataque surpresa ao Império Oriental, eles deixaram para trás um rastro de destruição. São Jerônimo escreveu: eles cobriram a terra de sangue e medo, e não respeitaram credo, hierarquia, velhos ou crianças.
By 450 AD, Attila was looking for his next target. The rich Eastern Empire was paying him an annual tribute of 2,100 pounds in gold to stay away. But the Huns couldn't live by plunder alone. They were nomads who needed to be on the move.
Their very existence was predicated on constant motion. They had to find always new sources of plunder, always new sources of fodder, and to stay in one place would mean that they would literally eat themselves out of their locale within a matter of weeks.
Átila voltou as atenções para o Ocidente, então governado por tribos rivais. Grande parte da Gália era controlada por Teodorico, o Visigodo, e Gaiserico, rei dos Vândalos, controlava parte da Itália.
The two men hated each other. Things came to a head when Gaiseric's son, who was married to Theodoric's daughter, cut her nose and ears off during an argument. Gaiseric saw a chance to destroy his rival. He encouraged Attila the Hun to invade Gaul and overthrow Theodoric. It was the opportunity Attila had been waiting for. The opportunity to divide and conquer.
Attila thought that it offered a pretty good cost-benefit ratio. You could plunder it pretty easily, and the chances that you'd be killed or captured or punished were not very great.
The Roman general Attius saw the writing on the wall. He knew the Huns well from having spent time living among them. He'd even been on friendly terms with Attila. So he knew that if Attila was allowed to conquer Gaul, he wouldn't stop until he'd swept south into Italy and completely destroyed the Western Empire. Attius knew that he would have to join forces with Theodoric's army to save the West. He couldn't defeat the Huns on his own. Though Theodoric was no friend of the Romans, he reluctantly agreed to fight alongside of them.
Para Átila, a chance de invadir a isolada e rica Gália era irresistível. No ano de 451, ele cruzou o Rino no comando de um exército com mais de 500 mil de homens, segundo os cronistas da época.
The core of the Hunnic army was surely the Huns themselves. There's no way to tell how many people that means. My guess is surely not more than 10,000 effective Hunnic warriors.
Mais impressionante que os números era a habilidade de dominar cidades, feito de poucos exércitos e povos bárbaros. Os hunos cruzaram a Europa, incendiando cidade após cidade. Cologne, Mainz, Metz, Strasbourg e Reims, até que em junho daquele ano, a tribo chegou a Orleans, e Aécio foi obrigado a detê-los antes que alcançassem a Itália. O general romano era o único obstáculo entre Átila, o Huno, e a tomada do oeste. Em 451, Átila, o Huno, espalhou a destruição e seguia rumo à Gália na companhia de seu exército. Enquanto isso, o comandante romano, Aécio, partia para Orleans com seu novo aliado, Teodorico, rei dos Visigodos. Não se sabe ao certo o tamanho do exército conjunto, mas historiadores acreditam que o número não superava os hunos. O exército chegou quando Sangibano, governador de Orleans, estava prestes a se entregar aos hunos. Era o início de uma sangrenta batalha. Sem medo de recuar e reagrupar as forças, Átila retirou seus homens das ruas e partiu para campo aberto. Já que o confronto era iminente, o líder preferiu travá-lo em um local onde os hunos tivessem total controle. O lugar escolhido foi o campo próximo à cidade de Chalon. Os hunos montaram um acampamento defensivo e se prepararam para aniquilar Aécio. Átila não mostrou interesse de lutar antes do anoitecer e permaneceu com seus homens dentro do círculo blindado. Estaria ele buscando mantimentos para as tropas ou apenas fazendo os romanos esperar horas em formação de batalha? Era quase noite quando a marcha finalmente começou. Mas a pouca luz não impediu que os romanos vissem o enorme exército formado atrás deles.
Attila's plan of attack was pretty simple, and that was to put the Huns themselves in the middle of the battle line and head as quickly and as directly across the field of battle and then tear apart the center of the enemy army.
Átila e seus homens posicionaram-se no centro do campo de batalha. Pelos flancos seguiam os ostrogodos e os gépidas, tribos bárbaras aliadas. Esta era a cavalaria padrão, munida de lanças e espadas e usando de mobilidade e força de ataque para infligir perdas. Do outro lado do campo, Aécio posicionou os romanos no flanco esquerdo e ordenou que Teodorico e os visigodos se alinhassem no flanco oposto. Para o covarde Sangibano, restou o centro. Não foi surpresa quando Átila demonstrou que atacaria o ponto mais fraco da linha.
The Romans had placed the weakest part of their force in the center. A person who was a commander of a group of barbarians who had just in the past few weeks been negotiating with Attila to surrender. The Romans placed that force in the middle so that they couldn't get away and couldn't run away. That's precisely where it turned out Attila's force struck. Attila's strength hit Roman weakness.
Mas Aécio não era tolo. Seu plano era levar Átila para o centro. Dessa forma, ele quebraria o flanco esquerdo e a linha dos visigodos, e os hunos bateriam em retirada para o círculo blindado. O plano era cruel. Aécio estava pronto para arriscar a vida de Sangibano e seus homens em nome do Império Ocidental. Átila ordenou um ataque montado contra a linha romana. A Batalha de Chalon estava declarada. Os hunos se lançaram contra Sangibano, que do centro da linha ordenou a retirada das tropas. Mas foi seguido de perto pelos hunos. Aécio sentiu a supremacia das tribos aliadas. Embora conseguisse cercá-los, seu exército perdia em número e não foi capaz de manter a posição.
His idea was that if his Visigothic allies on the right and Romans and Franks on the left could sandwich in Attila, then he could enfold them on the flanks and do some type of canine encirclement.
Os visigodos mostraram forte resistência no flanco direito. A batalha crescia em ferocidade.
The casualties must have been staggering, although the numbers given in the sources are just for literary effect. But surely thousands of men were perishing that day.
A massa de homens movia-se de um lado para outro e já não havia mais sinal de luz. Caso os hunos conseguissem voltar para o círculo blindado, os romanos dificilmente os atacariam no escuro.
It was late in the afternoon, and it was getting dark. They fought until they couldn't see each other, and then the battle continued into the darkness. It was one of these battles without end. The Visigoths chose to attack the flank of the Hun. So it was the Visigoths who saved the day.
O ataque visigodo foi suficiente para virar o jogo a favor de Aécio. Átila passou a ser pressionado pelos dois lados e os guerreiros hunos perderam o espaço necessário para realizar suas manobras e se defender. Enquanto o rumo da batalha se definia, uma tragédia se abateu sobre os visigodos. Teodorico, rei da tribo, foi derrubado do cavalo. Mas antes de levantar, foi pisoteado pela própria cavalaria. A posição de Aécio era delicada. Com a perda de seu principal aliado, será que os visigodos continuariam a lutar? E será que venceriam a escuridão? Em 451 d.C., o general romano Aécio lutou para salvar a civilização ocidental das mãos de Átila, o Huno. Na batalha, morreu seu aliado Teodorico, rei dos visigodos. Torismundo, filho de Teodorico, assumiu o controle da tribo. Felizmente para Aécio, a perda do rei despertou a sede de vingança dos visigodos. Os guerreiros investiram contra os inimigos e, de repente, era Átila quem sentia a pressão do combate. As perdas entre os hunos foram imensas. A fúria dos visigodos serviu de estímulo para os romanos, mas não havia tempo para explorar a vantagem. Com o cair da noite, a escuridão e o caos tomaram conta do campo de batalha.
In the darkness, forces became detached. Aetius himself, much as Stonewall Jackson, got detached from his forces and was all but lost, and then found his troops.
Na escuridão, Torismundo confundiu os hunos com seus homens e quase foi morto. Os visigodos estiveram perto de perder 2 reis no mesmo dia.
Night battles are ferocious, and the thing is, you need to disengage because you can't control the situation.
Átila cogitou voltar para o acampamento. A escuridão salvou seu exército do extermínio, e agora havia 2 escolhas: encorajar seus homens para outro dia de batalha ou fugir para viver mais um dia.
So in the worst hour of the Hunnish army's existence, when they were surrounded, they'd been defeated, what did Attila do? He deliberately screamed, yelled, he showed his masculinity, his fearlessness, and then he actually created a funeral pyre and threatened to immolate himself. So little did he value his own life, and so much did he value the reputation that he would die undefeated.
Neither of these 2 great commanders, they didn't know what the casualties were that they had inflicted. They knew, however, that their own troops were terribly bloodied. These 2 armies had exhausted themselves.
Aetius probably got little sleep. He was left with a real dilemma. On the one hand, he had the opportunity to crush Attila once and for all. On the other, he had to consider the future security of the empire. The Visigoths had only supported him because of Attila's invasion. The Vandals were also unreliable. These tribes only stayed in line because of a Hun menace. Remove that and warfare could break out all over the West.
There was the perception that maybe the destruction of the Hunnish army might embolden other tribes that are now our allies, but after the battle will be our enemies.
De volta a Ravenna, centro do Império Ocidental, o imperador Valentiniano III temia que Aécio se tornasse o homem mais poderoso do Oeste. O povo o aclamava herdeiro dos antigos generais e deu-lhe a alcunha de último dos romanos.
The next morning, it's essentially a stalemate. The Huns are in possession of their Lager, and the Romans are in possession of the battlefield, which meant that the Romans won, but the Huns were still there.
Registros históricos contam que Aécio tomou uma decisão somente no dia seguinte, diante de 2 fatos marcantes. Primeiro, o corpo de Teodorico foi encontrado e Torismundo foi proclamado o novo rei dos visigodos. Segundo, Átila demonstrou interesse em dar um fim ao impasse.
Attila withdrew the next day because he realized that his army was in no condition once dawn rose and they saw that horrific carnage on the battlefield and tens of thousands of people had been killed. He realized he was in no position to press home the attack.
Aetius knew his own personal standing was high. He had just beaten Attila the Hun, the scourge of Europe. But could he trust the Visigoths now that they had a new king? And what about Gaiseric the Vandal? The Hun invasion had been his idea.
Aécio era o vencedor. Átila bateu em retirada e o oeste estava salvo. Com a vitória garantida, o general tentou estreitar as relações romanas.
I think that what the battle did was it brought people together. It brought the military and political forces of the empire in the West together one last time.
A vitória de Aécio sobre Átila em Chalon destacou o fator de decisão. Assim como o esperado, os hunos deram início a outra campanha contra os romanos no ano seguinte. A tribo invadiu a Itália e deixou um rastro de destruição. Mas um contra-ataque romano às margens do Danúbio foi suficiente para levar Átila a um acordo de paz. Depois da Batalha de Chalon, o huno contava com um escasso contingente militar para proteger suas fronteiras.
The following year, Attila the Hun died, as he had lived, bloodily. He married a young bride, and drank so much that when he had a nosebleed, he drowned in his own blood. Without their fearsome leader, the empire of the Huns splintered and fell apart. And as for Aetius, his story ends badly as well. A few years after Chalon, he tried to marry Eudoxia, the daughter of Valentinian. In a jealous rage, Valentinian stabbed him to death. The last of the Romans was killed by his own emperor.